Greetings and welcome to From the Basement. In this Unity video, we're going to take a look at manipulating objects and maneuvering around in our scene. Now before we begin, you need to take a moment to make sure that we've got the necessary asset packs ready to go. You need to make sure that you have the Sample Assets Pack Beta from the Unity Asset Store. You need to make sure that you have the Terrain Assets package from the Unity Asset Store, not from Assets Import Package. Make sure you have the version that came from the Unity Asset Store. And we're also going to need the Skybox package from the Assets Import Package option. Make sure you've got those packages set up and loaded in so that way you don't have to pause in the middle of the video to grab those items. Okay, so before we can go over manipulating objects, and even really almost before we can go over maneuvering, we've got to have an object in the scene. So let's start off with our good friend Mr. Cube. Now the basic cube is something that you're going to be using quite a lot. It's very useful for marking off areas, temporary positions, temporary objects, you name it. The cube's good for a lot of things. So let's go into Game Object, Create Other. If I can stop moving the mouse all over the place, and Cube. Now, when you create things through that menu, I've never really fully understood Unity's logic for where it places things. So be warned, it's probably not going to create it in the spot that you want it to be in for a future project reference. Now, we have a couple of different ways of manipulating objects. One way is by using the inspector. The inspector will always show us all of the relevant information about a game object and all of its components and any values that we can edit that's been permitted by the scripts. At the moment, the only real component that we're concerned about is the transform component. Every game object, every single last game object has a transform component which defines its position in 3D space. So at the moment, we've got this nice little cube. Now, one thing to keep in mind about Unity units is everything in Unity is by default considered to be 1 meter. And these cubes happen to be 1 meter cubes. So the scale, by the way, doesn't always translate directly to meters. It does for the cubes, not everything else. All the scale value means is whatever the mesh size was, that's the mesh size that we're going to render this out as. So a 1 meter cube is going to be a little bit hard to stand on. So I'm going to change this to 25 on the X and 25 on the Z. Remember, this is a Y up world, so if I changed it to 25 on the Y, I'd have a 25 meter thick cube to stand on, which is a little excessive. I can just leave it at 1 meter. Now that I've got my scale set correctly, I probably should do something about my position. Generally speaking, you always want to start off working at the origin in a game world. So I'm just going to go in here and change my values to 0, 0, 0 for my position. I could have also gone to this little gear component here, clicked on it, and said reset position. That would have worked as well. I could also do a reset, but a reset would also take out my scale values at this point, and I don't want that. Now, if I didn't necessarily want this aligned like perfectly, to a grid, I could rotate it. Notice if I put my mouse cursor over really any of these component letters, it changes so that there is a two-way arrow. If I click and drag, notice that my mouse keeps coming back in the screen. I can rotate this around however I want. Or I could type in components as well. Now, if I plan on walking on this, this is probably a bad idea. So, oops. And I just did reset after I said, no, probably shouldn't do resets. So I got to put my scale back in. Okay, so we have a cube. And I wanted to get this in so we had a frame of reference. how do we actually maneuver around the scene? I mean, you may or may not have a good view right now of your cube. So how do we maneuver around? Well, in the scene view here, if I press and hold the right mouse button, I can look around. Now, as I look around, this little widget thing right here is going to be updating, showing what is the orientation of my camera here. Now, one thing you always want to keep in mind is you always want this Y to be pointing up. Unity is a Y up world. If we don't have a skybox in, it's kind of easy, potentially, to get completely flipped around, other than the fact that you might notice that, my left and right controls are kind of messed up, and start trying to add objects upside down, and that's not going to work out too good for you. So you always want to make sure that Y is pointing up. Now, for maneuvering through the scene, you can use the WASD keys, W-A-S-D, to fly through like you're in a fly cam mode and say a first-person shooter. So if I'm pressing and holding the right mouse button, W moves me forward, S moves me back, A moves me left, D moves me right, and Q moves me down, and E moves me up. Now, the longer I hold down those keys, the faster I am going to move. So I'm holding down the D key to strafe around, and you notice that I'm rapidly just spinning out of control there. Or as I hold down the W key, you notice I'm moving slow, slow, fast, 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 faster, 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 faster. Ludicrous speed, go! I'm out of control. And at this point, I have no idea where I am. I cannot see my cube anywhere. No. If I unclick and deselect it, I can't see my cube anywhere. There might be, I can see a tiny little flicker of a few pixels out there. But I might, if I had a Skybox on, I wouldn't see that. I just wouldn't. If you lose your object, or you lose where you are, you can always double-click on something in the hierarchy, and it will zoom your mouse cursor back to that object. You can also press the F key with an object selected to focus on it. One last thing for maneuvering in the scene. If you hold down the Shift key, that will give you a temporary boost of speed. So if you want to immediately start moving fast, you can hold down the Shift while you're doing a WASD or a Q or E. Alright, so I have my platform here. There's a couple of other things I'm going to want to do before we actually start trying to hit the play button here. One is I want to set the skybox. And partially because gray annoys me, partially because it's very useful to know where your render settings are. So I'm going to go into Edit, Render Settings, and here's where I can set things like my fog and skyboxes and stuff like that. We're just going to take a look at two things right now, and that is our ambient light and our skybox material. On your scene view, if you notice, we've got a bunch of things over here. I'll deal more with these later. Texture and RGB, most of the time you just leave those alone. Now, do you want 2D mode on or off? We want that off. And then there's this little light symbol here. Toggles the built-in lighting on and off. Currently, I'm using sort of like a default lighting mode. But that's not really what I'm going to see in-game. If I want to see how things are going to look in-game, I turn that little sun thing on. You notice that that gray thing goes like really dark gray, because I have no lights right now. Now, I could change that by altering my ambient light. For instance, if I make my ambient light a bright red, that's going to make my cube a bright red. By the way, that's probably a bad idea. Or if I make my ambient color full white, then my cube becomes full white. If I basically turn off my ambient light, then the cube becomes solid black. In other words, it's completely unlit unless I provide additional lighting information. Usually a happy middle ground is what you want to shoot for. Still dark enough that you can see your lighting, but not so dark that it becomes an eye strain on the player. The Skybox. A Skybox is basically a way of, at the extreme far distance, putting in textures. This gets into a whole thing of Z buffering and depth perception and things like that. Just simply accept that, yeah, skyboxes are really add a lot to outdoor scenes. And so what I'm going to do is I've got this little circle and a dot here next to my skybox material. If I click on that, it's going to bring up this selection menu. Now this is context sensitive, and that it will only show me the type of asset that particular box is looking for. This box is looking for a material, so therefore it's only going to show me materials. Now, not all of these materials are good. You definitely do not want to have materials that have transparent information in them for your skybox. For example, if I select these leaves, might be good if you're trying to simulate an acid trip, but other than that, yeah, that's probably not what we want to use as a skybox material. Instead, you want to use something that actually looks like a skybox. So I'm going to take the Eerie Skybox material here, double click on it, and you'll notice that this looks a lot better. It definitely loses the trippy nature of the other one. So if I'm like standing more here on ground level, looking out, and see, okay, all right, sky, clouds, looks good. So now that I have my skybox, I need to add some sort of a light source. The easiest sort of go-to light source when you're just starting to work on a scene is to add in a directional light. So I'm going to go to Game Object, Create Other, Directional Light. And initially that's going to turn that into Day Glow Bright. And maybe that's not quite what we want, so let's talk about these arrow things here. Now, for the directional light, its position does not matter. This is simulating the sun. And so it's basically like an omnipresent light source that is shining down at this specific angle. You probably should put it someplace that is nice and visible. But to manipulate this around, I just simply grab the arrow on the axis that I want to move it in. Or if I want to move it in two axes, you'll notice that each of the combinations have these little boxes. So if I want to move it on the XZ plane, I can click on this green box here and move it on the XZ. Or if I want to move it on the ZY, I can move it there. Or if I want to move it on the XY, I can click there. This is the translate icon here. To switch to rotate, I can either click on the rotate icon or I can press E. The translate is W, so we've got W-E-R, W-E-R. Once you get used to this, if you're not already used to it from, say, Maya, this becomes a very rapid way of switching between your different modes. And this guy here, by the way, it's just the hand. That's for like left click and dragging around in your scene if you want to get someplace quick. So let's say I want to change the angle at which this guy is at. Now this is maybe a little bit later in the day, so I've got a little bit stronger of an angle there. Now let's toss in a character controller. So I'm going to go into Sample Assets here, Characters, Third Person, Prefabs, and I'm going to drop in the third person character. Kind of drop them in the middle. And I might want to switch to the translate widget here and drag them around. And just to go over that one more time, because I realized I kind of did that a little bit fast. To drag something in from projects, you just simply left click and hold, drag it in, and then release. Now notice there's a difference here. If I'm over the cube, it looks like he's far away. If I get off the cube, it kind of looks like the character jumps up. That's because Unity's default behavior here is that if my mouse isn't over something, it'll just use its weird logic in trying to determine where to place it. If my mouse cursor is over something, it will try and place it on that. Can't really see it very good. Let me hit escape and get a little bit closer in here. Like if I try and add in another character, you notice that Unity is actually placing him on the same level as wherever my mouse happens to be on this other character. So he's like standing just about perfectly on his head right now. So you can drag in like that. Now we need to add in a controller. For this, we need to make sure we delete our existing main camera. Go into cameras on sample assets, prefabs, and we want the free look camera. Now the thing I like about this is it's going to automatically hook itself up to the character model that we dropped in. So that if we hit the play button, we've got a standard free look camera for controlling our character. We've got jumping, landing, crouching, walking, all sorts of fun stuff. All right, so a few more things here, just sort of to make sure we've got all of the different pieces here. Let's turn this into a little bit of an obstacle course. So I'm going to go into Terrain Assets. I'm going to grab a Sycamore with Collider. And drop a couple of those guys in here. One on each corner. I'm going to change their rotation a little bit so that each tree doesn't look exactly the same. And by the way, you can also do this with scaling. So if I like click on the Sycamore, press the R key, scaling, I can either scale it down or up. I can make it wider or fatter. Although obviously if you do this too much, it really abuses things. Or if I click on the center, I can do a uniform scale. So I don't want to scale it too much, or I can just type in values manually here. Now, one thing that might happen if you scale it, notice this tree now is no longer even with the ground. And I completely borked the shadows on it too, but that's a different problem. How do I get this tree perfectly back down on the ground? Well, I could grab the move widget, drag it down, and then just try and figure out how high up should I have this tree. As you can see, I'm already having a lot of trouble just simply getting it lined up so I can see what I'm doing. Oh, nope, that's too high. There we go. Now that should be good, but I'm still like penetrating down a little bit in there. The other way is to snap to surface. Now how you do this is with the object selected, and in this case it's usually easier to, there's an option up here where you can toggle between center and pivot mode. It doesn't really have too much of an impact most of the time other than just ease of use. It's a little bit easier to do this with pivot mode turned on. Now what I can do is I'm going to raise this up first, because this method can be a little bit persnickety. I'm going to raise it up so it's off the ground. I'm going to do a Control-Shift, and you'll notice that this gets me a little white box here. If I click and drag in that box, what's going to happen is I'm going to snap. Notice I'm sort of just like free-floating, free-floating. As soon as I get my mouse solidly over the surface, it snaps the tree to that surface. Control-Shift is a very powerful movement tool for getting things to snap to the floor when you want to make sure that things are snapped perfectly to the floor. And so now I have got this tree snapped down properly. Now I want to put in some platforms to jump on. First, I'm going to move my little character here off to the side. I am going to go into Sample Assets, go into Prototyping, Prefabs. I've got a whole bunch of cubes here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take, I've got this platform, 8 by 8 by 1, drag this down, and again I'm going to use my snapping trick, although it looks like snapping is not behaving itself this time. Another way of dealing with movements is to use control drag for snapping. So if I do a control and then drag this up, it snaps it up one. And I'm honestly not entirely sure why. There we go. In this particular case, I had to be on center to be able to do my snap. And on center, it worked correctly. So now I've got this somewhat largish platform here. Position it off to the side. Drag in another platform. And it looks like this guy is not centered proper, not flushed down properly. There we go. Looks like I had an error the first time. I'm going to take this one, I'm going to drag it up one notch. Now there's one more little trick here. If I want to put in another platform. I could drag this one in, or on this one I could do a Control D, watch my hierarchy, duplicate. Now I can drag that out, do a Control, drag it up. Now I've got a little puzzle thing here, a little platforming thing that I can do. I hit the play button. I can run through and jump up on these platforms before jumping off. And our tree is still horribly broken on the lighting. Okay, so that pretty much covers all of the maneuvering. Just to go over it real quick again. When you have an object selected, you can directly manipulate its transform properties by either typing in the numbers directly or by using the arrows here to affect its rotation, translation, scale, what have you. You can grab the object and use the control widgets here. W is for translate, E is for rotate, and R is for scale. Or you can use the buttons up here to change between your widgets. An effective method for snapping things to the ground is to do a Control Shift and then drag, and it will snap it to the surface the best that it can. And one final thing, actually two final things. Control D will duplicate, and you can drag that out. And there's one final movement trick that I almost forgot about that is exceptionally useful, and that is Snap to Vertex. If, while I have the Translate widget selected, if I press and hold the Shift key, if I press and hold the V key, got my keys momentarily messed up there. If I press and hold the V key, you'll notice as I move my mouse cursor around, it seems to be snapping to the corners. Basically, I am now able to snap my cursor to any of the vertices on this object. And so what I can do is I can take this object now and perfectly snap it to the vertice of a different object. So I can perfectly snap those two platforms together to make a seamless platform. And that truly does cover all of the movement. Now for a little bit of practice. You might not think that you need to practice things like this, but if you are fighting the editor, if you're having to struggle with what command do I do, you're not going to be very effective in trying to create scenes or gameplay. And so what you need to do is practice recreating this scene. Completely wipe out everything in the project. Re-import the skyboxes. Re-import the sample assets. Re-import the terrain assets. Create this square. Add in the directional light. Add in the trees. Add in the platforms. Add in the character. Delete the old camera. Add in the new camera. Add in the directional light. Hit play, test it, and make sure everything works. Delete everything and do it again. Yeah, it's not very fun. It's not very exciting. but you need to practice these actions so that way they start becoming second nature to you, and it will greatly help you out as you continue to work with the engine. And so, until the next video.